Well, hello guys, and welcome to another gear change show. I'm here to talk about Formula One. Since I know in the previous video I talked about Formula One and IndyCar. But I wanted to do a video on just Formula One, and I've got the Ferrari 312T for you guys to do some stuff. I'm doing some setup and I'm doing some stuff talking, so when the engine does get going, I can actually talk. So Formula One. So Formula One started back in, well, the roots for Formula One started back in the 1920s, just about. There was in the 1920s thereabouts. So and it evolved. It evolved in the 1920s. The 1930s, we saw the pre-war Grand Prix cars from Auto Union and Mercedes back in the 1930s. And it kind of evolved from there. So, you know, big massive engines and 6-liter V12s and 6-liter V8s and stuff like that. And that's where it kind of sprouted from. Just to reiterate, then we'd pause for the war, and the first modern day representation of Formula One would be 1949, when just after the war, and cars like the Ferrari 125 F1, Alfa Romeo, Maserati. Lotus has not quite been the picture yet, and Mercedes would be a few years off. Would be a few years off in the 1950s. They'd start competing in like the early 50s, and they wouldn't compete for a long time due to a certain event in the due to a certain event in 1955. For those of you guys can tell, the 1955 Le Mans accident was one of those. It was relatively not a great race, and Mercedes would kind of die away, but and stuff like that. But yeah, so back in 1949, 1950, Formula One cars were basically single seat tubes with basically four bicycle wheels attached to the body, with some suspension and a gas tank. And the maximum engine allowed back then was 1.5 liters turbocharged. Turbocharged or non-turbo back then. I know at one point, it was I think later in the 50s, though, it would grow to I think in the 50s it would grow to 2.5 liters, and you could have a 750cc supercharged engine or something like that. But not too many people went for that setup. And then eventually some people thought, hey, we can turn this into a world championship. So I think it was in 1950 or 51, I think it was like in the mid 50s, they decided to crown a world champion. And then the 60s we had then in the late 50s, early 60s, sorry for my bad driving right there. I was slip off once. They ended up reducing the engine size in the late 50s, early 60s to 1.5 liters, and you could also, and as I said, you could also have a supercharged engine as well. A lot of people went for the 1.5 engines, and that kind of engine power shot down. It went from 350 to 350 to 380 horsepower down to like 220, 230, 240, and that rule stayed in place till 1966, 1967, when it went back to 3 liters, when it went to an expanded 3-liter formula, and that's when Lotus, Ford, and Maserati and Honda both all had either a V12, a V8, a V8, or a back then. No 4 cylinders, no 6 cylinders, no turbochargers. You could have a turbocharged engine, but I think it was like 1.5 liters or something like that. But people figured it out that it had bad fuel mileage, so a lot of people went the 3-liter route, which is what this car, the 312T in the background, went with. A Ferrari V12 back in 1967 used to have 410 horsepower. This one, Niki Lauda's car, at 495. And power stagnated a little bit. It got up to like 500 or so in the 1970s thanks to the oil crisis, and that's sort of what this car is. This is a 1976 Formula 1 car, 312T, and it had a 495 horsepower, but it was very powerful. Power wouldn't shoot up until the late 80s, and when turbochargers would come out. The first turbo era would come out in the turbo regulations would come out in 1978. Only Renault was kind enough to take care of those regulations, and and that rode on until 1989, and in that time, cars like Lotus Renault, Honda and the Williams. We also had Ferraris, 1.5 liter Tipo V8, V2, Tipo V12s as well. So, yeah, you can only imagine a 1.5 liter, either a 6-cylinder or a 4-cylinder, and that's when turbochargers went mad crazy, which I will actually get to in the next part of the video, because the turbo era is very, very crazy. Another thing that kind of set racing apart is a lot of single-seater races back then were set distances. Grand Prix could be anywhere from 50 to 75 laps. The shortest race on the calendar, the shortest number of laps on the calendar was obviously the Nürburgring. Wow. With a track at 14.5 miles, I'm pretty sure. I think they only did like 20 or 30 laps. I remember the cars were going over 300 kilometers per hour, which is 180 miles an hour. And safety was a huge thing back then. I mean, most motorsports were dangerous back then, but most motorsports were dangerous back then. Most motorsports were dangerous back then, and Formula One was no exception. So it was, and you know, now the only man in the world who really cared about safety more than anybody else was Jackie Stewart. Jackie Stewart, if no one knows who Jackie Stewart is probably infamously for being the guy that a lot of track owners hated, because he wanted tracks to be safer and much easier to compete on because of their safety regulations. Remember, the cars he drove in were cars that had barely any setup on them, barely any wings, anything. If you guys look at a 1960s Formula One car, you guys will know exactly what I'm gonna say. But yeah, so next I'm gonna show you guys a turbo Formula One car, and then I'm going to show you a modern car. Well, here's part 2 of the video. Well, so leading on from the 1980s, leading to the 1980s, we had turbo cars like this. This is the Lotus 98T. This was a later model. Ayrton Senna made this very famous. This had the Renault Gardini 1.5 liter 6-cylinder, capable somewhere in the region of 1,200 horsepower on race day. Car could only make about 900 on, it made 1,100 in qualifying, made 900 on race day. Reason being was because the teams would do all sorts of things. They would put turbos that were more responsive. They'd put tires that were stickier. They'd put gearboxes in these cars that were meant to do 4 laps. And this was a trend that Ayrton Senna, Nigel Mansell, and all the other greats, Nelson Piquet, would all use during the turbo era, the first turbo era, I should say, and kind of would ride the wave from 1979 all the way till 1988, when the turbo cars would be banned, and effectively in 1990, cars would be normally aspirated, and they would be limited to 3.5 liter V8s, V10s, V12s. But most of the cars were mostly 6-cylinder. Ferrari I think had 6-cylinder as well. Honda was also big. Was also back then. It says on the side of the car here, I really can't see any of the script. I have it on low boost at the moment, but these cars were insane. These cars could have the 1,400 horsepower in racing spec. I mean, in qualifying trim, and that's with the sticky tires, the gearbox, and the turbocharger. The turbocharger. The reason why they had more boost in qualifying is because of these special ones. The reason why they didn't have it in the race, well, because the engines, the gearboxes, and the tires would shred apart after 4 laps. So Ayrton Senna, Nelson Piquet, Nigel Mansell could all do blindingly fast laps in qualifying, but they couldn't do those laps in the race because, well, cars would fall apart. And of course, cars like this, the Lotus 98T, were very susceptible to failures because you'd watch it in qualifying. After 4 laps, car wouldn't sound very good at all. like Senna and Mansell and all these other guys, they would peel into the pits after 4 laps because that's all they needed to do. They only needed to do 4 laps. And Senna more or less was always on the pole, so and Mansell would be there. PK would also be there with the special BMW 4-cylinder. Yeah, you heard right, 1400 horsepower out of a 1.5 liter 4-cylinder motor. I know all you guys over in Japan are like, oh, the 2JZ can make 1050 horsepower from 3 liters. These cars were the original four bangers for racing. So, and then eventually in 1990, as I said, the V12, the engine regulations would go back to normally aspirated. Powers would drop. Powers would drop from about 1400 horsepower to about 800, 750 to about 800 at one point, and then we get into the 90s, which would see the rise of Renault. It would see Renault's dominance come back after Honda would kind of see some resurgence in the 90s. Ayrton Senna, Ferrari would also win a couple of titles in the 90s, and Renault would strike back in 94, 95, 96, and then Mercedes in 97, 98, and 99, of course. And then 2000, we know only one Formula One team was good for that. Now, I'm not going to show that car because I think I've already done a video on it, or I might do a separate video on it. Would be a separate video. Would be the F2004 car. When I say that Mercedes and Ferrari went at it, well, I shouldn't say BMW was also becoming a powerhouse again too with their V10. And then Renault would strike back with 2005, 2006 with their V10, and then their V8 in 2006. Then the regulations would change in 2006 to V8s, 2.4 liter V8s. We'd see that from 2006 all the way till 2013, and then we get the new turbo era. So, but yeah, so between the years 1989 and 1999 were crazy. Then the years 2000 to 2010 were crazy because we'd see the dominance of Ferrari. We'd see a sprinkle of Renault coming back with, and then we'd see Red Bull dominate the 2010s. And then, of course, 2014 and on, we just saw we've seen Mercedes and Red Bull take over again. Red Bull, of course, but I'll get to that in a minute. Then, and of course, we had that one season with Braun GP, but we won't talk about that. And then 2010 to 2013, we'd have Sebastian Vettel. No, he needs no introduction. He would use the 2.4 V8 formula to his advantage. The 2.4 era, probably some of the most interesting racing of all time, because we would see because in 2009, 2010, we'd see the introduction of KERS. Hybrid system. For those of you who are into Formula One now, yeah, KERS and hybrid systems have been around in Formula One a lot longer than that. So, a lot longer than that. So, and then of course Mercedes would start dominating 2014, and we'd have to wait till 2021, shall I say, for Red Bull to come back. And then of course 2022 we'd also see the introduction of ground effect again. Oh yeah, by the way, I didn't mention all the weird technology. So in the 70s we had ground effect. In the 80s we had turbos. We also had paddle shift gearboxes come in the late to early 90s. I think the last H pattern gearbox ever used in Formula One was 1995 with 40. The Formula One team with their Ford Zytec V8 and stuff like that. So yeah. I just want you guys to hear this. I'm not going to talk for a minute. I'm just going to let you hear this wonderful engine. By the way, you're probably drowning me out, but oh yes, by the way, when they downshifted in these cars, they made an epic flame. Can't show you that because unfortunately the bodywork is unbelievably oh yeah. I did my 4 fast laps, so my turbo burnt out. Sorry. So I did this so I could talk a little bit more. You can hear the car in the background. But yeah, so I literally lived Schumacher's dominant, the Schumacher years, the Sebastian Vettel years, and watching Lewis Hamilton rise to dominance in the 2014 era. 2014 era. It's just Formula One is a very interesting feature. Turbos, paddle shift gearboxes, ground effects, aero cars. Yeah, I'm looking at you. I'm looking at the Brabham. I'm looking at the Brabham from like 1975 with the fan car. Look that one up. I'll have to tell you guys about that one. That'll be a story for another day. But yeah, I wanted to just give you guys a little bit of a history on Formula One. This is Mike Camo for the Gear Change Show. So I hope you guys enjoyed this. I'm going to put this together now so I can give you guys some entertainment for the day. So I hope you guys enjoyed this, and I'll see you guys later.